Hello and welcome back to my 10 favorite people. Hope you're doing well. I'm incredibly excited for today's video because I truly can't believe sentiment is this fearful while the Bitcoin weekly chart looks like this. We have seen the same thing happen during every consolidation phase this cycle where Bitcoin rallies, starts consolidating, everybody starts giving up hope, and then Bitcoin rallies again, starts consolidating, everybody starts to give up hope, rally, consolidate, rally, and here we are consolidating again. And instead of expecting another rally, all I'm seeing is people calling for the cycle top being in and we're never going to see an alt season again and it's all over. And yes, this has been an especially painful range compared to the previous ones. In the summer of 2023, we only had one false breakout and then broke out on the second attempt. In January of 2024, we had one false breakout, one false breakdown, and then we broke out to the upside. But this time around, we had one false breakout, one false breakdown, another false breakout, and then we're chopping in the range once again. So I understand why this is tough for so many people, especially because altcoins have been taking a beating. But this is exactly why I called this time period the Great Reset in Monday's free weekly report, because we went from the market being extremely greedy and everybody talking about significantly higher prices to now everybody giving up hope and thinking the cycle is over. But over and over again, we have seen that these fearful periods actually end up being the best buying opportunities before Bitcoin goes back to greed once again. So my base case remains that Bitcoin grinding higher is the most likely outcome. And of course, there can always be a possibility of a pullback. So I decided to put my money where my mouth is and deploy some of my cash at these prices. Now, the three assets I chose to add to my portfolio are XRP, Doge, and Cardano, not because there's anything special about them or I have a crystal ball telling me that they're going to be the outperformers, but more because they are in the top 10 and are most likely going to be the first ones in line for US ETFs. And I want to move my portfolio more towards a market cap weighted strategy, similar to what investors do with the S&P 500, where you get allocated to stocks based on how large their market caps are. And now we all know the statistic that 90% of hedge fund managers underperform the S&P 500, and I would assume 99% of retail traders underperform it. And I think this asset class is going to work the exact same way. Of course, there are going to be few exceptions that outperform the index, but I think the majority of investors will be better off just following these market cap weightings and allocating their portfolio accordingly instead of always trying to figure out what they should be buying or selling. And I think this is going to be even further exaggerated by these crypto index ETFs that are going to be filed this year and most likely released. I would expect a lot of investors that don't want to spend too much time researching this market just closing their eyes and allocating to these index ETFs, because that's the exact same way they allocate to other asset classes like stocks or commodities or different sectors. I also feel pretty good allocating to XRP here because if the cycle isn't over, it and Solana are the first ones in line for an ETF. And now this isn't me making a commentary on XRP in particular or saying I expect it to outperform Solana. They've just both performed very well already this cycle, and they're first in line for the upcoming ETFs. And Trump seems to be a huge fan of this whole Made in America framework where he seems to be endorsing these assets. Another reason why I'm quite comfortable allocating some money to altcoins at this point is because I do think Bitcoin is still quite expensive at this point in the cycle at its current prices. Can it still do well? Of course, I still think it'll go higher this cycle. And if you're buying it here with a multi-year time horizon, I'm sure you'll do just fine. But I do think most new investors joining here are not going to be interested allocating to six-figure Bitcoin, and they're going to be a lot more interested in allocating to these smaller projects on a shorter term basis. I'm also still optimistic that Ethereum is going to turn it around and start performing well once again now that it truly feels like we have seen capitulation. Can it go a little bit lower? Of course, but this opportunity here at the 200-week moving average does seem like a good one in my opinion, especially because sentiment right now is terrible. We're seeing record inflows into Ethereum accumulation addresses. We're also seeing decent ETF inflows over the past week. As for Solana trying to hold its 20-week moving average for dear life here, we have seen it chop below it before, but we really don't want to lose the 50-week, which has been support for Solana this entire cycle. And I think the main narrative that will be driving it over the next few weeks is what goes on with these ETF filings, because the SEC just acknowledged the Grayscale Solana ETF filing, which usually is the first step towards them eventually approving it, especially under this new administration. But of course, what ends up happening to Ethereum, Solana, and other altcoins is going to rely very heavily on what Bitcoin does, but I do think the future still looks bright for Bitcoin. We are also entering what has been historically a very good seasonality period for Bitcoin, which is the late February-March timeframe. Bitcoin went up during that time period in 2021. Bitcoin went up during that time period in 2022. Bitcoin did well during that time period in 2023. Bitcoin did well once again during that time period in 2024. So does it have to do amazing once again? It's not a guarantee, but the odds are very likely in our favor here. So I'm expecting that pattern to repeat and for Bitcoin to have a good February, March once again. And I think we have the perfect narrative and backdrops for it. We know that Congress is advancing crypto regulation. We saw the Fed board governor Christopher Waller supporting regulated stablecoins. We're also seeing the House Financial Services Committee saying they're going to work with Trump administration to deliver dollar-backed stablecoins for Americans. We're still seeing a ton of bullish stuff coming from various states around the US. We've seen Utah talk about Bitcoin Reserve. We've seen Missouri. We've seen Kentucky, Florida, and we're also seeing record high trading volumes on the CME, which is an institutional exchange, and we're still seeing ETF inflows. So I still think the future looks bright. I still remain optimistic that the cycle top is not in yet, and the fact that sentiment is so terrible right now, while all of these narratives are developing in the background, makes me quite optimistic. But of course, there are still some macro concerns. Bitcoin is still pricing in the global liquidity downtrend we've seen over the past few months, but we are seeing a nice recovery here. Now that the US dollar index looks like it wants to go down, we're not seeing more rate cuts priced in quite yet because we saw good labor market data on Friday, which means the labor market is still quite strong and the Fed doesn't have to step in too soon. But the good news is we're also not seeing a resurgence in inflation. So if something were to weaken in the economy or the markets, maybe the Fed ends up stepping in a little bit sooner than the market currently anticipates. But I would rather have a strong labor market that keeps the Fed rates paused than a weakening labor market that causes markets to panic and forces the Fed to step in aggressively because of recession fears or a stock market collapse. So as always, we'll continue keeping an eye on global liquidity. Could macro send Bitcoin lower because of some black swan? Of course, and I'm ready for that possibility. We also still have that open CME gap down there, and nobody knows whether that's going to fill in the short term or if it's not going to get filled until the bear market, but we will keep an eye on that going forward. As for the S&P 500, still chopping around in a range ever since the inauguration, so it's no surprise that Bitcoin has been chopping around as well, but I remain bullish in the longer term. We still have huge federal deficits, and we've seen a 39% increase year over year compared to where the federal deficit was by this point last year, which means the trend of larger deficits is only increasing, which makes me expect the money supply to increase alongside that debt expansion, which keeps me bullish on risk assets like the S&P 500 and fixed supply risk assets like Bitcoin. But anyway, let me know what you expect. Is the cycle over, or does Bitcoin still have higher to go? And let me know what you think of my new portfolio allocations. I'm really excited for this experiment to see how well a market cap weighted index does compared to people that want to try and trade and time the market. And the good news is that these percentages are so small that if all three of those new assets disappeared tomorrow, it would barely impact my overall portfolio and my performance this cycle. But I do think there could be some upside if we do see those new ETFs that index this market and we see new ETFs for XRP and Solana. But as always, we'll see what happens. Thank you so much for the support on the recent videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.